Good evening. Welcome to the Billy Wilder Theater, home of the public programs for the UCLA Film and Television Archive. My name is Paul Malcolm. I'm the senior public programmer for the archive. Before we begin, as a land-grant institution, the Film and Television Archive at UCLA would like to acknowledge our presence in the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Gabrielino and Tongva peoples. We're humbled to do work in this community. We want to thank all the individuals and organizations that have helped make tonight's screening possible. All of the archive screenings in the Wilder are free thanks to a gift from an anonymous donor, and we are grateful to them for their support. And a big thank you to our community partners for this series at the UCLA African Studies Center, the UCLA School of Theater, Film, and Television, and the VA Albertine. Thank you all for coming out to our survey of films by Cameroonian writer-director Jean-Pierre Bekolo. Hey, he's right here. Oh, hold on. I still have more. Sorry, Jean-Pierre. I faked you out. From last night's program of speculative Afrofuturist fictions to tonight's films, which emerge very much from Bekolo's conception of a cinema of place that is a cinema rooted in the local, the people in the neighborhoods, and even the cinemas of a specific community, we can see clearly the full range and breadth of Bekolo's vision and practice. We are thrilled to be presenting these rarely screened works, and we're even happier to do it with Jean-Pierre here with us in person. Now we give him a big round of applause. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to walk through the program, then I'm going to have Jean-Pierre come up and say a few words. So tonight's program begins with Jean-Pierre's debut feature, Quartier Mozart, which premiered at Cannes and Locarno and numerous other major film festivals, and announced the arrival of a new African cinema voice. It will be immediately followed by a Q&A with Jean-Pierre, moderated by UCLA Associate Professor Shelleen Greene. Then after a 10-minute intermission, we will present Aristotle's Plot from 1996, a work commissioned by the British Film Institute as part of its Century of Cinema initiative. Both films tonight will be presented on 35mm, and we want to thank Arsenal Berlin in Germany and the George Eastman Museum, respectively, for making the prints available to us for tonight's show. So now, please help me welcome to the stage Jean-Pierre Bekolo.
Sorry. Okay, thank you. Thank you for coming again tonight, for those who were there yesterday. And thank you for those who just came for these screenings. Today's films are, let's say, my earlier work. My very first film has been a long time now, Quartier Mozart, and then Aristotle's Plot. That is the second film, and I think the two are like 2 years apart, in production. There's not much I can say because myself I have to rediscover them, and then I'll watch them with you, and then we'll be able to discuss at the end. Thank you for coming.
I'm going to be a little louder today, Jean-Pierre, but I want to thank you once again for joining us so that we can at least have a conversation about these two films. Tonight we're screening, and we've just screened Quartier Mozart from 1992, your first film, and after our break we'll be screening Aristotle's Plot. So I have a couple of questions just to begin our conversation. And I guess, to begin with, could you tell us more about your transition into film director? This film was made in 1992. You were 25, and you had been trained as a physicist and had worked also in Cameroonian television. You had been a music video director, working with Manu Dibango, for instance. Could you tell us about this particular moment in your career when you decided to make the feature film, your first feature film? Could you give us a little bit of that moment?
Yeah, good evening. I would say that growing up in Cameroon, in the 90s or 80s, was not very easy to know what to do, actually, except things like very classic professions, which obviously parents, very conservative parents, always want you to do. Mm-hmm. I was studying physics. Basically, we were like all of us. If you are good in science, you do math or physics or biology. Then the rest were like in literature or economics or law. So we didn't know much what was actually possible except those very classic things. Then you had like ways to go to school to be either a professor, either be a public servant, and I would also say that, um, as we can imagine, we didn't have television. We grew up without television, and actually, I'm joining the very new television that has just been built, and then they were recruiting the first technicians. Obviously, even the idea of going to take this test was not really something I would say that was easy. Just that there are so many possibilities in. I mean, it was just one of the things that came, but that was not really something you could talk to someone about. So we did the test. We were so many of us. We were like 1,000. For that one, they were taking only 20. So you had to go through like 4, 5, 6 steps. Then they divided in two. They said 12 are cameramen, 8 are editors. So I was an editor, so I didn't know what editor was about. So they said to us, editors, come and visit Cameroon television. And we went there, and there was this, because at that time, Cameroon television was new and was run by the French. So we were like the first, to be the first technicians. And then I really liked the machines, because they were like very nice editing suites, not like today where it's just a computer. It was like a spaceship, with buttons and lights and making funny noise when we put cassettes inside. And there was this guy who was the editor. He was from Martinique, and he was dressed like a star himself, like a singer, and he was an editor, And he was putting these tapes in the machine, and he would make noise, and it was a music video. And I've been always frustrated because I've never been able to play music, but I love music. So I could see him playing with images and cutting this thing and making a music video. I didn't even know what it was. So I called him on the side, and I asked him, this seems to be a good thing. Is it a good thing? He said it's a good thing. I said, because I think I might really continue with this. Okay. And he said, you should continue. From that moment, I didn't ask anything to anyone. I would go to university, but I would really spend so much time, mainly at night, editing and trying to learn to edit, And I would say I was also kind of lucky because I was just playing with we were expecting our real training, but in the meantime, I was at television, discovering television, and it was a good moment, at least for Cameroon, because it was like all these Cameroonian overseas came to work for television, including the local ones. So it was like a new energy, like building something new, a new dream. What happened is that we also had a new president too. It was like kind of 3-4 years after we had a new president, after 25 years old president. So all that was kind of new era, I would say, a lot of hope. And then one guy came and said, "Are you an editor?" I said, "Not yet, because we're training, So he said, "Come." And then I just sat with him the whole night while he was editing. I think he just needed somebody to talk to while he was doing this. And then in the morning, everybody saw me with this guy, because he was the biggest director, of television. And everybody thought I was also one of the biggest editor, but at that time, I didn't know anything about it. I didn't even push any button that night. So from that morning, everybody started talking to me very nicely, thinking that I was an editor, and then I stick to this guy, and then he was also working with the best cameraman, and I kind of joined the dream team without knowing anything, So I would say I stick to them, and then more opportunities are coming, including even the whole idea of going to France. One guy came to me and said, tomorrow, go and do this. It's a test, go to France for training at the Institut National Audiovisuel. That was the best school, at least for us being Cameroon, to go to. So, and that's what happened. And I did it, and then I followed what he said, and then I was able to go to France. So just to say that even if it was it was not real. It was a kind of a dream world or whatever. But I would also say that I embrace it very naively, but I kind of felt that things were possible. It was like a lot of hope, like almost whatever you dream of could happen. That was kind of the mindset, the feeling of joining all this. But I was an editor. I was not a director, Okay. And it's only once I went to school that I always say this story, but I hope nobody will tell her that story. Claire Denis, French filmmaker, she's a good friend. She made this film called Chocolat in Cameroon. And I was so excited. I called everybody. I knew, let's go and watch the opening of the film because I knew some people in it. So I was in Paris. So when we went to see the film, it was a great film, but I was so disappointed because she was just telling the story of her being a little white girl, and then with this cook, this. I'm like, this is not Cameroon.
No.
So I understood that she was telling her childhood story,
Right.
and I also realized that if that kind of film I have in my mind, had to kind of be done, I have to do it myself, and I would say that was the moment I decided I'll do this as director really, so that I'll make sure that, whatever I had, I was thinking of how I would see cinema, it would be my own take on it.
And I think that's such an interesting story, the idea that you would, see this as a moment of showing what you could do at this moment of possibility. And I'm still struck by, being 25 years old, just taking it upon yourself to make a feature. Could you tell us a little bit about your style? And I guess the question is, were you a cinephile? And how did you sort of approach the concept of your film? Because it's so inventive, bringing together, as many people have said, magical realism, African storytelling, along with a sort of, global approach to the history of cinema, bringing together, these different influences in order to tell this very unique story.
I think my life has been in reverse. I was like an old man when I was young, but now I'm kind of a kid when I'm older.
Okay.
So I was very serious. That's how I feel, when I look back. But I would say I was also really kind of because it was a time of discovery, also I was discovering the world, I was discovering life. I was in France. Paris is always good for watching a lot of films, and actually I was lucky also that when I went to France, the person who trained us in Cameroon was actually an American guy, Roy Licus. He lived in the center of Paris. He offered me his kind of one of the bedroom he had with all the film books, and I could go to watch all the films in Paris, the cinemas. So, and I had a guide who could tell me, what is good, what is not good, what if it's important. Actually, when I said I'm going to make my first film, he kind of discouraged me. He was like, "You're too young. Why are you?" So I didn't speak to him for like months before, because So, but I would say that I didn't think about the world per se. I didn't think about. I was not really conscious about the world much. I was in my world, and I was just trying to do this thing, and also making sure that I put it in a way that was really kind of portraying what personally I felt and where I came from. In Paris, also, it was a time of African cinema with people like the one who did Yaba, Yelen, Suleiman Sissé was also like Ousmane Sembène. I didn't encounter him much in Paris, but there were many like filmmakers who were making this kind of rural films, very kind of quiet, very natural. Me, I grew up in Yaoundé. Even if it's not the biggest city, it's kind of noisy. So I was feeling like this Africa, I didn't really kind of know it.
Right.
And I would say I was even the editing. I come, as you said, from music video, so it was kind of dynamic, but that one was too slow. Those things was too slow. So I didn't kind of find myself in this. I was also attending, but not as a film. I was just going there as an audience to the French Film School, where they had a lot of screenings. I think they had showing film schools from Jim Jarmusch, from Spike Lee, so it was really very interesting moment where we had all these things going on. And but also I would say a lot of reading, a lot of reading. The transformation idea, I remember, it came from one book I just read, the idea of being able to transform a character. But in that story, I think it's Apule who wrote this about the donkey being transformed. But all this was showing me the possibilities, And then I felt that, I kind of started constructing. It took me 1 year actually to write a script, but it was mainly dialogue was very important because I want the language of Cameroon to really be there, even if it's in French. So I really work on the archetypes of these kind of neighborhood characters, and now structuring the story, just this kind of how they would evolve, how what will happen with this. So it was at the same time learning and doing at the same time, and I had nobody really to tell me what not to do, So I didn't know what was wrong, what was right, So maybe that's my luck. I never had producers mainly, so I always felt free to do whatever I felt like, even if it was really not something that will pay off.
Yeah, I was thinking, about the transformation or gender, and perhaps, our screenings last night were, focused on women protagonists in both films. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the young Queen of the Hood who appears here and is transformed into Montip. Could you tell us a little bit about that? And there's also a sorceress, right? The sorceress who sort of transforms and then enters as the character Panka, who can remove men's penises by shaking hands. Could you talk a little bit perhaps about how gender reversal or perhaps matriarchal figures allow for this social and political critique? I don't want to call it a theme in your work, but I did notice it in this first one that you do figure, the sorceress as a sort of starting the film in many ways. And, the transformation scene is so interesting when Queen of the Hood awakens as Montip. It's so very Terminator-like, but also, I think, very invested in sort of African storytelling and the idea of the sorceress sort of opening up this new mode of magical realism.
What I can say actually on this woman in my films, I think it's my mother. I know it's my mother, so I think. I think it comes from very clearly the childhood we had, and as you can see, my father was a police chief, like this police kind of figure. So, but I would say that when I say it's my mother, it's mainly because we lived in a situation where we grew up in a situation where my father took a second wife, a little bit like in the film, but he made our life miserable somehow. And then as a kid, obviously, we created a kind of terrorist group, my mother and me, in the house, So we were doing a lot of things, and I would say that it also helped me see the society, how the unfairness of how, because they want to be good with my father, people will be really like not even saying hello to my mother anymore. So I could see how the society was. I was between 8, I think, and around that age, So I could see exactly all this. And obviously, I don't know how it kind of translated into film, but it's clear that I don't have a kind of normal view or the view that any young boy would have had if that situation wouldn't have happened. So I think that's what it is. But now I don't know. It's very conscious. It's just that it kind of shaped my perception, of things, because we did a lot of things really, like to kind of, I don't know, maybe hoping that my father would get rid of that woman. I don't know what was supposed to happen, but yeah. Now the magic part of the film, I think it's maybe I was afraid that my film won't be enough of a tale, but I also thinking that using magic for transformation, like even if I consider cinema as magic itself, so that it's not much having magic in the film, but also help the film being the magic. It's like both. So that the whole experience is kind of taking us somewhere, and I always had this dream of transformation, even if I just wrote a book actually called, it's a very complex title, Cinema as what? A Transformative Tool for the Therapeutic Intellectual. Yes. It's a manifesto. It's a small book. Where I feel that Africa hasn't transformed much, despite all the intellectuals, gathering awards and recognition all over the world. How come all this brain power hasn't been able to transform Africa? But whenever it's being transformed, it's mimicking the West, and it's living because Western culture has dominated, not because it was the best, because it was just maybe the more brutal, or it was just the most whatever, but it was not the best. We know that in many, at least from this African perspective. But so the transformative potential of the society of the world has been obviously something I'm interested in. So in the book, I'm saying that I feel that there's something we're doing wrong. All of us, artists, intellectual, and I consider colonialism as an accident. The encounter between West and Africa, even if some people that I'm minimizing, but I think it's still something that happened one day or something. And then when you have an accident, I felt that accident became everything for us. Now even when intellectuals they study colonialism, post-colonial. So all the identity became the accident. Yes. I feel that we forgot that we left maybe people at home. We forget that we were going somewhere. It became all about the accident. So cinema, what I like with cinema is motion in that sense, because motion is like, even if I had to kind of read history with cinema gaze and or lenses, somehow we would never stayed on the accident. That's why in the book I also talk about motion pictures, but also motion thinking, where there are many ideas that are frozen as far as Africa is concerned. Just to say that we have accepted the frontiers of Berlin Conference. So it's kind of frozen. Why can't we rethink or redo these things? Another thing that is completely frozen is even the diaspora. It's like, I always compare it to the Berlin Wall. When Germany was split, in two, the day the wall came down, the two Germany decided to reunify without even thinking about the consequence. But the idea that Africans have been split, but the idea of reconnecting is not even an agenda. So I think there are many ideas that should be put back in motion. Yeah. So cinema, I see it as kind of something that could help, history in general get back to motion. And yesterday we talked about Afrofuturism and the film about Afrofuturism. The idea behind or African futurism, the idea is really to imagine the future without that accident. Look, so I think if we need to really make some of these imagine the future, the first thing is to imagine a future in which Africa would have never met the West. So now it's kind of triggering kind of a new imagination. How would we be like I don't know, how would we be doing this if we have never met the West? So projecting that future, it's a whole field, that will kind of put in motion thoughts, and maybe speculating to have something else. So anyway, so that's how I kind of see the transformation and the possibilities. And obviously, cinema is even, you have two motion in cinema. The motion of the picture just moving, and then the motion of the dynamic of the story from the timeline going from A to Z, where either the character grows or whatever it's at stake,
And I think, I wanted to perhaps, think about what you just said in terms of motion and motion pictures, and maybe just talk a little bit about Aristotle's plot. I don't know, this was 1996, and this was a BFI commission to celebrate the 100 years of cinema. And it becomes this opportunity, I think, for you to meditate not only on motion pictures and its impact, but also the history of African cinema. And we're not showing this film during this series, but there's another film that I think you made around the same time. It was called Grandma's Grammar, and it features Diop Mambeti in this film. And it's interesting because the grandmother, and actually your film just inspired a series in London at the Documentary Film Festival organized by Elena Gorfinkel. And she writes quite eloquently about grandmothers, right? And the idea that the grandmother gives you, I believe, the idea to reflect upon or challenge grammar. And I was wondering if you could perhaps think or take us a little bit about that kind of thinking with that film about the cinema, African cinema, and then this idea of possibility, the what if scenario, that is something that you can actually sort of activate in this medium, right?
Yes, the way the BFI, for the film we're going to see, Aristotle's plot, the BFI, there were many problems with the BFI, but I will just talk about this part. So the way they design the whole commissioning thing is that they wanted me to put some filmmakers in the film. That was the only thing, which obviously I kind of agree with. But then what happened, I interviewed a couple of them, and I didn't see how it would fit, inside the whole thing. And okay, I decided in another way to put them in another way you see in the film. But Djibril Diop Mambeti case was a little bit different. I already talked to him about doing something, interviewing him, and what happened is that we were in South Africa at a conference, and we were supposed to shoot that scene somewhere, and then we looked for locations. We couldn't find, and I really don't know. After driving around looking, I came back. I had fever, so I was like, I had to go to bed or something. I took some aspirin or whatever. Then when I woke up, I said, okay, let's just do it here in the bar of the hotel because then it will be easy. And then I put everything, we set up, we started recording. And then I said, I want to ask you a question. Just, we had a conversation about what we want to do. So just start talking. We were shooting 35 millimeters. So he's start talking. He said, thank you, Mr. referring to the conference. And then I said, no, cut. It's not about what we're doing here. He got so angry that he said he doesn't want to talk to me anymore. He left. So I had another, he's from Senegal, and then I had another sound guy from Senegal who kind of went to talk to him, and he didn't want to shoot anymore. So what I did, I wrote on a piece of paper 3 questions. Okay, the first question was, who is this man called cinema? Mm-hmm. The second was, what are your relationships? And the third was, the second was, how did you meet? And the third was, what are your relationships? I gave this sound guy the piece of paper to go give to Jibril. And he gave it to him, and I was checking, how he's going to respond to these 3 questions. Mm-hmm. These 3 lines took like forever for him to read them. It was just like this. For like, I don't know, endless time. Mm-hmm. And then he said, okay, let's do it. Mm-hmm. Okay. So then when we came, now, when I put together the film, okay, then we roll, and then he said, the question was, who's this man called cinema? And then his answer is like, who tells you that it's a man? For me, it's a grandmother who tells stories. Sometimes she tells me the same story, and when I ask her, she says, go speak to grandma, the grammar of, So anyway, he goes on and on and on and on. And then the second one is, how did you meet? And he take a glass of wine. He said, the same way I met alcohol. I wanted to get drunk, So anyway, so that's the film. That is this short on him. Obviously, he's not in the film. That's why I'm telling you the story. Otherwise, you would watch it. So I would say it was interesting to kind of meet that concept of the grandmother who tells stories, but also of grammar. He was very clear about that, and he spoke about it many times. Because what I like about Djibril work in general, he was one of the first to question the form, and the language of cinema on the African perspective, not just telling the story, and also really was very daring, He was also very young, because when he made this film, it was Tukibuki. I really recommend everyone of you to watch, and that was in Cannes, I think in 74, 75. He was really young when he did it. So I think the idea of having a kind of perspective, not just being on the story or on the tale, was very important, in that sense,
Wonderful. Thank you. I asked a lot of questions this time. I'd like to open up to our audience in the few moments we have left in the Q&A. I see one hand here.
Thank you.
Oh, hello? Yep, yes. There I am. Yeah, I really enjoyed the first film. I thought it was very beautiful. I like the idea of what you talked about, the Berlin Wall between Africa and the diaspora. What advice do you have for filmmakers from the diaspora to begin to break down that wall?
I didn't hear the question.
You didn't hear the question? Okay. Could we maybe repeat the question? It was about other directors who are working, perhaps coming from, I guess, the global south, we can call it, or within this post-colonial context?
Yeah, like filmmakers from the diaspora, how do we begin to kind of break down that Berlin Wall that you talked about between us and like Africa? Or what advice do you have?
Yeah. Okay, obviously, cinema is, I made this film that was banned in Cameroon called Le Président, and the whole idea of that, people tend to think that cinema can do much, which I believe, otherwise I wouldn't be doing this. But I think somehow, because when they banned the film, it was a kind of feeling like cinema can threaten whatever, the longevity of the president. I think in that sense, maybe I don't want to say that they're too fearful of something that is not that powerful, but it gives us strength and power to believe that cinema can do something. And yesterday we were talking about what cinema can do to us. At least it could motivate us, it could transform the actors of this thing, meaning ourselves, more than any system per se. When people kind of watch a film and feel like I have to do something. I can't just go to bed. I have to kind of do something. That's that level, I think, cinema is kind of transformative. So I would say obviously people divide the documentary genre and the fictional genre. Me, like my late work, like just this film we just finished in Berlin, I take reality, I put it in fiction, and then I add the fiction to that reality that happened. So anyway, hoping that the mix of these things would kind of have an impact on reality. I don't know how efficient it would be, but it's just like a kind of strategy I have myself. So that's kind of how I see things and cinema being used. But obviously, it might not really be the only thing that needs to happen, in terms of some of these things to happen. But I like the idea that, when I'm depressed, I want to make a film, really. When I don't, because I'm somebody who doesn't like the world the way it is much. So I just feel like doing a film, it kind of cut me off from everybody. All these things I'm complaining about, I'm not happy. I just had playing with my own little world. Whatever it's going to do, if it does, fine. But so far, it hasn't done much. But I just think, at least for myself, it's kind of helpful. So that's kind of how I would put it.
Thank you.
We have another question.
Hi, so I have two questions. The first question, I'm still working through it, but I was thinking about the films that we've watched, and I thought what was really cool was the ways in which you break the fourth wall in these different ways. So you may have like direct looking into the camera, but then even in naked reality, there's like you can see all of the like what's happening behind the camera. You see the scaffolding, and then all these ways that you're constructing what would be movie magic, but we're seeing it before we see the magic. So I think you have, so it's making me also question the ways in which we're defining the surrealism of like the folklore of like, wait, it's not really surreal, it's real. So I don't know, I wanted to ask if you can talk more about these ways in which you're breaking to interrogate. So even with Bloodettes, like the billboard and stopping to question the genre and question our own as the audience of like, what are we going to do? So yeah, can you speak on that? And then the other question I had was about the magazine in this film that we just watched, and like the comics, because I know there was that scene with like the photographs, and then you had like the speech bubbles, and then you had the police officer who was reading what seemed to be a comic. So I was just like, wondering if you can speak on that too.
Yeah. Okay. I would say that maybe I feel like I think too much, for a filmmaker, which is not good, actually. Because I think I have had time just doing things in a very mechanical way, or mimicking what other people do, or what, because it's been done like this. So the idea is always like, when you start doing, you cannot think, but when you start doing, you feel like, why am I even doing this? Why should I just copy what these people do? Why do I think it's... So I always question everything I kind of do. And also having a kind of critical look at it. For example, if you talk about like a reality where you can see things happening in the background and having... Because I was... I don't know, I was talking about this when I was saying that I like the making of sometimes better than the film. So it's like, okay, if you start liking... not what the director was trying to do, but what things that happen. I don't think it might even help, to watch a film with these things. I'm not sure. But also testing how much the story would be distracted and how much what is being said is making something fantasy is actually. we kind of know all these things already. Yeah? So I don't know how much it's affect us to really feel how real is the witch or the whatever is being represented. But cinema itself, again, is its own magic. That's what I think, somehow. So if we are able to tell a story and get all these things in, maybe you are just playing with what you have in your hand, and you don't need much of a big budget to produce an effect on this. But it's just a kind of critical way of even do things, or to approach cinema. It might work, it might not work, but I just feel like sometimes throwing it there. As I said before, if I had a producer, this thing would never happen. It would be impossible for him to accept this kind of thing. But I had no producer, so I'll just do what I feel like doing. So the second question
was about the comic book.
Yes, just to kind of put in some medium. That generation, was into. As I told you, we grew up without television. Comic books were big medium, really. And those kind of stories, I think it was in Amina. We have a kind of, magazine, like everybody was reading back then, mainly love stories and stuff like this. So I kind of felt that it was a reference to that time where we didn't have soap operas. We had the Amina telling those stories. So I just felt like throwing it in. But in the whole process was like shifting medium, and there's even a scene where there's no image at all, where there was supposed to be a thief in the house. But I was just I like the idea of that people sitting watching nothing. So we're just playing with all these little things, as far as medium is concerned.
Thank you. I think we have time for a couple more questions. 2 more? Okay.
Thank you. Hello. I wanted to just say thank you first off for being able to be here while we watch both of these films. Earlier today, I was actually talking to one of my good friends, and we were talking about kind of like what sci-fi and fantasy really means to us. And I found it really fun to kind of be in a space where watching this movie, I would call it something that was more fantasy because of all the witchcraft and background behind it. But at the same time, describing it as African futurism is also something that's just in the shots and also in the storytelling, the music, and everything around that. So I just want to ask, do you have a difference between fantasy and science fiction, or is it something that you think is all in one thing?
That's very interesting because there's this idea of obviously Africa being about tales, storytelling, oral traditions, grandmothers. So all this is what Africa is. And sometimes it's also kind of locking Africa in the past, with this kind of nostalgia of a kind of paradise, I think if you ask a young person in Cameroon how Cameroon is going to be like in the future, I think most of them will see New York or Paris, So it's also the idea that there's no representation of image. There are no images of the future somehow. So whatever we're producing, I feel like whatever I'm producing, in this kind of speculative way, because it doesn't matter the story. We kind of playing with what's there, producing images. I think it's a way to kind of start creating a future somehow, because the impact the film will have, if there's any, on somebody watching, will actually should have an impact in the future. So I think somehow we shouldn't split those two things. I think somehow cinema is already a kind of futuristic act, if I want to put it that way. It doesn't matter if the film itself is about the past or And obviously I could make a film like this, that is more just like, you call it magic realism, whatever it is. And then the one yesterday, somehow, it's some people actually in Colombia, they call it, they had a name for it. I forgot the name they use. The name will come back, but they kind of give it a name I never heard of before. So I would say it means that these objects, if you can call them, we're creating, are not just about like a newsreel on something that happened and that's like factual. So it's kind of triggering something, it's almost like documenting the future in a way, with things obviously that come from imagination or imaginary. But one of the things is that we should know is that yesterday I was talking about making movies from a place, not for an audience, really. We are kind of, when you look at it on an African perspective, in a battle of imaginary. It's almost like everybody, a lot of young people have like a non-African imaginary in their mind because of so much production coming from the West, So, and if it feels like if you have to respond to that, if you have to kind of fight back, what would you do? Obviously, I feel like I'm not going to make 10,000 films, like the character in the film you're going to see or watch them. But if I make one film, I really need to make sure it has some layers. Maybe you have to watch it twice. Maybe you need more, actually. Yesterday, somebody said to me, I would like to watch this film another time. Can you give me a link? So that's kind of a feeling I wish, to have, because film is something people kind of throw away in garbage. They say, I've already seen the film. It's like, it's finished, done. So don't bother me. I've seen it already. I don't think it happens with books or music. You don't say that I've listened to that song. So I'm just trying to make sure those films are not to throw away, are not to be, and even if obviously I didn't know this film would still be watched today, and or if you will still find interest in this many years later. So I think somehow is the idea of always looking at this medium that came to us, like the whole colonialism brought a lot of things in a critical way, and also see how do we reappropriate the medium and the practice of the medium.
Thank you.
Oh, we have one more? One more question?
Yes. Oh, weird. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Hi. Can you hear me? In the progressive African world, there is more a focus on Pan-Africanism. So I was wondering, to your knowledge in the African film world, is there more of a drift toward Pan-African perspective on filmmaking? I know a few years ago, I think either France or Britain bought the Nigerian film company, commonly known as Nollywood. And I found that depressing because I figured that more than likely they will sort of suck out all of the progressive African energy in it, any kind of films that they produce. For example, Essence Magazine, which is an African-American magazine, was purchased by, I think, Time Magazine, and all of the progressive African-oriented energy from the magazine sort of disappeared, and sort of it's like, basically like wallpaper now. So all of its energy, African energy, is pretty much gone from it. So to your understanding, is there any kind of drift toward Pan-African filmmaking? Because there's an intense amount of possibilities there. I mean, it's almost epic, the African culture, it could be.
Okay. Um, okay. Well, I think you're talking a little bit about capitalism here, but what I would say is that my personal experience, I became an African filmmaker before I became a Cameroon filmmaker. I can tell you how, at least back when I started, we were like a group of filmmakers from all over the continent, and we will meet not just at FESPACO, which is a Pan-African festival in Ouagadougou, in Burkina Faso, but all over the world. We'll meet all, because there are African festivals all over the world. So we would meet, but then when you go to FESPACO, at least back in the days, it was, and I didn't grow up in an African village, but I discovered an African village through cinema. You go to this Hotel Independence, that was like the base of the festival in Burkina Faso, Ouagadougou. There was a swimming pool, and around the swimming pool, what we would call the elders of African cinema. You will see Ousmane Sembène, you will see Souleymane Cissé, you will see all of them. But you, as a young filmmaker, you're not allowed to approach them, you know? So you only go there if they call you, and they talk to you, and then they kick you out again, you know? Don't get close to where they are. And even in the hotel, there were like rituals. This hotel, for example, room number 1 was for Ousmane Sembène. Room number 2 was Souleymane Cissé. So you had all these things. So for me, I didn't grow up in a kind of hardcore African village, but I discovered the patriarchal of African culture through cinema. So for me, when people say, are you Cameroon? How can you say an African filmmaker or Cameroon? I'm an African filmmaker in that sense. And for me, that Africa exists as a country. When people say Africa is not a country, but for me, Africa was a country, or has been a country, at least with cinema. And we kind of grew like this. So we are very close to each other. We create a lot of organizations. The FEPACI, Pan-African Federation, I was one of the members on the board, and then the Guild of African Filmmakers of the Diaspora, you know, in Paris. I was the Secretary General. So we kind of had this journey together, you know, as activists somehow, because we knew it was not about capitalism. We knew that we can be looking for money, but we can try to make films, but we knew that it was not about making money, really. We kind of pick up on the older generation, because the Ousmane Sembène started writing books and making films during colonialism. You know, so Ousmane Sembène, when he would write a letter to you, he always signed La Luta Continua. For me, who was born after independence, I didn't know what Luta he was talking about. But that's his generation. They knew that, you know, making films was a kind of struggle, you know, not just as to find the resources to make films, but also as to kind of really not forget, you know, that they grew up, were born in countries that they didn't own, that were controlled by colonialism. So I would say, because I'm now the youngest old guy or the oldest young guy, how do you say? So I'm in the middle of 2 generations, you know. So in that sense, when I hear your question, it will make sense for those who didn't experience what I experienced, you know. But this thing had exist. Somebody said that the Africa we're dreaming of is behind us, which is unfortunate. But obviously, the idea is, how do we continue or open up to something new or different, but not forgetting, you know, like that spirit and that mind that produced an important body of work. You know, it's not something new. That's what I want to say. You know, it's there actually, even if it's suffering from a lot of problems and difficulties. You know, but this spirit is actually there. Maybe with all the changes, the new technology, all the stuff coming, maybe something new also need to appear. You know, that is more in phase with our time. You know, maybe, you know, we're not going to sign La Luta Continua because now, you know, there's another kind of luta these days. You know, so I'm just trying to say that that spirit, you know, is actually the history of African cinema.
Thank you. I think that's a great way to stop or to perhaps transition into Aristotle's plot. Jean-Pierre, thank you so much for talking to us again.
Thank you.
It's wonderful
Thank
to
you
hear
very
you.